Right. Good morning, everybody. If you're here, I can see, I think you're all coming through on my counter. Hopefully you're here for 1.5 lovely hours of getting stuck into benchmarking definitions. This obviously is as a result of you doing something really, really awful in a previous life. There's a lot of material to get through. It is pretty much a massive brain dump of information. So it'll feel a bit relentless, but hopefully there'll be a lot of content imparted within, say, 1.5 hours that should get you off the ground running. We will be recording it, so you'll actually be able to relive the joy of this session and zoom into some of the detail if you need it. As always, if there's stuff that pops into your head afterwards, you just get on the blower to us and we'll sort things out. So without further ado, I'm going to get cracking and try and remember how Zoom works, because it's been so long since I've used it. So hopefully you can see a presentation there. Hang on, I'll get the next page up and then I can explain things. So yeah, the purpose of this is as built to help ensure the quality and credibility of your data in your annual return. And obviously those data returns are generally open between April and finish at the end of May. And this is really for those poor individuals that are tasked with collecting and submitting the data, which is a fairly important job. I know people have got tons of other jobs at the same time, but actually, the credibility of the entire exercise, the value of the exercise, being able to compare your data with others, just relies on a high level of quality as far as the data is concerned, which is difficult for smaller organizations because you haven't got so many bums on seats. The regulator for some years has been banging a drum for data quality as well, so it is actually quite a hot topic. So what I'll be covering is just a little bit of an introduction to benchmarking. What we find is that as every year passes, people rotate, people that are responsible for benchmarking and getting stuck into the data. They might rotate out of a job, they might rotate out of the organization, new people come in. So I think it's probably useful just to have a quick recap about what benchmarking is all about, and particularly what Acuity Benchmarking is about. Then we'll get stuck into the actual definitions, which is the nitty-gritty stuff. After each of these themes, I'll pause and I'll pick up your questions. What I'm going to ask you to do, because there's quite a few people listening in, rather than let you all talk and have the sound on at your end, we're going to use the Q&A function, which you'll find on your taskbar. If you use that Q&A function, if you could pick just a really succinct way of pitching your query, at the end of each theme, as I say, I'll hoover up those questions and I'll do my best to answer them. If there's anything that I can't answer straight away, what I will do is I will take that away and I'll find the answer and I'll get back in touch with you. And in fact, what I'll do is I'll do a kind of a response sheet that we can put with the materials from today's session, so that you've got a record of any questions that I can't actually deal with on the day. As I've said, this is unfortunately 1.5 hours long, and it might even overshoot if we see value in it. Basically, there's still questions to be answered and clarity to be had, as it were. It will be recorded. So it will appear on our website like all our other webinars, in a few days' time. We'll also put this presentation on there. And as I say, in due course, just a little bit of a sheet on anything that I couldn't answer. That will also appear there. I think I've already kind of apologized for the fact that this is going to feel like quite an intense session. So yes, good luck, everybody. Right, to get stuck into the benchmarking basics side of things, just a quick reminder, before I do this, I'm just going to stop sharing and see if there's any Q&As. No, so far. No, good. Right, I'll crack on. Benchmarking just really means it's about comparisons. It's about comparing with other organizations. Not everything that you performance manage needs to be benchmarked. You might have quite a comprehensive and necessarily so performance management framework that has lots of metrics associated with it. Not all of that has to be compared with others. So the question basically is, you should only benchmark that data where comparing to others will provide additional insight. And how do you get that insight? It's about exploring variation in the results. Why is one organization clearly much better? Or why is this certain group of organizations outstanding performance at this? Or why are their costs particularly low on this issue? So basically, what those comparisons do is they throw up the need to analyze and find a story behind the data. Why is the data? Why is it so? What's the story behind it? And one of the things that you're trying to rule out there is that context is a major driver, because most of the time we're benchmarking to understand differences in performance. So before we can analyze differences in performance, we have to rule out contextual factors, which are nothing to do with performance. And by contextual factors, the key contextual factors might be the client group. Some client groups are going to cost you more to manage than other client groups. So typically you'd expect supported to be more expensive than general needs. Those that have quite a spread, a geographical spread, we would expect those to be somewhat more expensive, expensive than those organizations that have got a big clump of properties in a very, very defined space. So that's what we're trying to do. So why do we do it? It's about understanding what good looks like. And by understanding what good looks like, then you can dig deeper and tap those organizations up to understand what they might be doing differently. How do they crack a specific key business process? And we know that key business processes sit behind any housing management outfit, getting the rents in, doing the repairs, turning around voids, that kind of stuff. So it enables you to identify that and discuss process and practice issues. It also helps you to set evidence-based targets. Quite often in your business plans or in other documentation, you might want to set aspirational targets to aim for top quarter in this issue, that issue. By having this database, you're not just kind of wetting your fingers, sticking it in the air. You've got hard evidence based on peers, what's possible to set those kinds of improvement targets. You might also, particularly with cost data, if you see that you're particularly cheap on something and you're also fair to, well, middling to poor in terms of performance, and everybody else is pretty much chucking a bit more money in, you might want to use it as an evidence-based way to bid, to kind of split your resource cake up and stick a bit more resource into that. Also, benchmarking helps you by striving for savings, striving for better performance. It helps you mitigate risk in a very challenging operating environment. So typically with costs, for instance, it helps you create just a little bit of a buffer should hard times come. Within the current context, particularly post Grenfell and with the advent of consumer regulation, this kind of data also enables tenants to hold the organisation to account. Finally, by benchmarking, it is actually a regulatory requirement that you benchmark, that you compare, particularly in the context of the VFM standard. So it enables you to provide assurance to the regulator that you've got a grasp on cost and performance, all within context, but that you understand your performance and you understand how cost relates to it. That provides the regulator with assurance that you're running a tight ship. It also it gives the same level of assurance to any other stakeholder that you might have. So previously I mentioned about back here that benchmarking provides no answer. So sometimes I think people benchmark and they think it's going to somehow the benchmarking fair is going to wave a magic wand and you'll be able to sort everything out. It gives you no answers at all how to fix things if you're looking a bit sick on performance or cost. It just enables you to ask questions, to dig deeper, to try and understand what's actually going on there, and to gain the insight on which you can make intelligent business decisions about where you stick your money, what you improve, what you're going to aim to improve. So really, it's the basis for intelligent analysis. What do I mean by intelligent analysis? It is about looking at cost and performance or cost and quality in the round. You can't just look at cost without looking at what performance is coming out the sausage machine the other end. And you shouldn't just be looking at this cost and performance data. You shouldn't just be looking at benchmarking data in isolation. You should be chucking other stuff into the mix, which might be other quantitative data that you're capturing yourself that you're not comparing, but it might be lots of qualitative info that you have. And the kind of thing I'm talking about there is customer feedback that you get from your complaints. It might be customer feedback that you're getting through some of the questions you ask in surveys. It may be external service reviews, internal service reviews, audit stuff. All of that stuff gets chucked in the strategy wok, as it were, stir-fried, taken in the context of your customer base, your geographical base, your historical funding base, for you to start to understand what's going on in your organization. And you shouldn't be looking at specific metrics in isolation. Like, so for instance, you might be doing brilliantly at arrears, but is that because void loss is taking the hit? You might be kind of thinking, oh, our FTAs are really brilliant, but is that just simply because you just wrote off a load of money? So there's always, if you like, other metrics that might be in conjunction that tell the full story. So you might have really good, you might be turning your voids round and your repairs and hitting your marks, hitting good turnaround times on the metrics for that, but is that at the expense of satisfaction because you're doing a poor job, whether it's on the void spec or it's on the repair. So yeah, that's what intelligent analysis is. I'd say unintelligent use of benchmarking is benchmarking. We're talking ballpark stuff. It's not a finely calibrated tool for doing some kind of crude league tabling situation. So that's what I guess that can be what might happen with some of this consumer regulation TSM metrics. Is it depends how the regulator publishes that information come 2024. There is a risk that people just rank organizations in terms of their performance without taking into consideration the different business models, the different operating contexts. So just because you're one position above another organization, benchmarking doesn't work like that. Talking about quartiles is probably more helpful. Do not get hung up on immaterial, inconsequential, tiny, minor apportionment issues, particularly, with any metric, like, you know, that you might just have one little issue with a void that you can't work out. Should we count it? Should we not count it? You know, just one little thing here and there isn't a big hill of beans. And the same goes with costs. When you're trying to work out your costs, and that's for the next presentation. But again, sometimes people agonize where to put how much of somebody's time. Do they put it in one pot or another? Saying that somebody does 16% versus 15% of their time on a specific activity is irrelevant, but 25%, 50% is relevant. Also, we shouldn't be using benchmarking to beat people. Less is more as far as benchmarking is concerned. As many of you know, I try and encourage you not to keep on dreaming up new metrics to all collect as a group. To try and keep the metric set as tight as possible should be the objective, because then you've got more chance of getting whatever set is, of getting that right. There is a risk, obviously, with the advent of 22, and by that I really mean 26 regulatory consumer metrics. Obviously, we're talking about a lot of data knocking around. All the more important that we keep Acuity benchmarking as tight as possible. What do I mean by getting the metrics right? Everybody sticks to the definition. Don't bother doing benchmarking unless you're going to stick to the definition. And you need to be astute that the definition that we're using for a given metric might be different to how you traditionally always counted something in your organization. If you're not prepared to do that, you probably shouldn't be benchmarking, because it buggers it up for everybody else and potentially undermines the credibility of the sector, really. Definitions generally are quite good, and they deal with the material issues that need to be captured, but they can't legislate for every eventuality. So they sometimes, or often, will be silent on a very peculiar issue that you might have, in which case a degree of interpretation needs to go on. Some of that interpretation goes on with us as, if you like, specialists in such data. But quite often, if it's a very thorny issue, we'll have a conflab with our colleagues at Housemark, and we'll determine a line on it. But it'll always be about going back to why was this metric created? What is it actually trying to get at? What problems is it trying to solve? The clubs are also a useful forum to discuss these kinds of issues. If at the end of the day you're still struggling, just get on the blower to us, and we'll sort it out for you. For most metrics, the usual format is one number divided by another, which may or may not be multiplied by 100 to give you a percentage. But it's generally one number divided by another, and the posh terms for it is a numerator divided by a denominator, gives you the result. So your definitions, the definitions are there. So this is basically what the data collection sheet looks like, that many of you will be familiar with. Those of you that just collect data on an annual basis, you don't need to worry about quarters 1 to 3. At the end of the year, which is imminent, you will just be filling out quarter 4, sticking your data in there against the appropriate PI metric. If that you have any doubts about how this metric is defined, you click on the little blue question mark and it will give you chapter and verse. As I say, if there's still something you're not sure about, having looked at that, get on the blower to us and we'll sort it out for you. We'll tell you. I think this is my final benchmarking basics slide. Benchmarking generally, there will be a slight change to this with the advent of the TSMs. But traditionally, benchmarking focuses on the primary forms of managed social housing. That often means owned as well, because quite often, let's face it, most of you are in the business of social housing, not because you want to do private sector housing, because you want to do social housing. And you build that housing or you acquire that housing and you manage it. That's your core business. You don't outsource it. Some organizations obviously do outsource the management, and some of you may have be working to contracts for other organizations. Generally, what we're doing is we're trying to understand how the manager of the social housing is performing. In most cases, it will also be the owner as well. I don't want to get too much into it today. This is for workshop 3, but the nature of the TSMs, thanks to the likes of Grenfell, etc., it takes a slightly different slant, because that's all about making the owner, the landlord, making them more responsible, making them more accountable. So that's all about ownership. What I would say is there's a number of our metrics that are geared around management to capture the manager of the social housing, but a lot of our metrics are similarly, just similar to the TSMs, geared around the owner as well, the landlord, and repairs metrics are a good example of that, because many repairs metrics have their roots donkeys years ago when there was a similar approach, and it was about the landlord. So I don't worry too much about that distinction. I'm just simply making the point that a lot of existing Acuity metrics are about management. What do I mean by social housing? I mean general needs, social housing, housing for older people, and support. If you really want to understand the distinction between the types of social housing, because other forms of social housing are available as well, those definitions can be found on the profile page. And the profile page is, if you go onto the data entry tab and click on it, you'll get 2 options. The PI data is the previous page that I just showed you, where you enter your benchmarking data. The profile page is another page that provides that context that I was talking about earlier on. And so the kind of context it asks for is stuff like how many general needs properties you've got, HFOP and support and stuff like that. And so because that stuff is embedded there, we've got the definitions that we've taken from various government sources that will tell you exactly where the distinction lies between those 3 principal types of social housing. So really, this is what Acuity is getting stuck into. What you'll find when we get to the TSMs in workshop 3 is for regulatory purposes, for submitting your TSMs, this distinction doesn't exist. And what I should say is this distinction only exists for certain metrics where in the past members have said it's actually useful for us to break this up into different client groups. Because, for instance, turning round, as I say, this distinction doesn't apply to repairs. And it doesn't apply to your cost data. It's mainly stuff like arrears, voids, that kind of stuff, because the client group makes a difference. And you guys in the past have specifically asked us to look at these separately so that you can compare them separately. So anyway, you'll find the distinction on the profile tab in the blurb there. We capture other information on the profile page, as I've said, to give us the context. And why that context is really useful is that for those of you that really get stuck into your benchmarking, rather than just benchmark against the club that you're in, you can handpick from all over the country those organizations that look the most similar to you. And the only way that you're going to find out who looks the most similar to you is if this contextual information in the profile tab is updated when you stick in your end of year data. So what kind of data goes in there? Well, as I say, it's the number of properties you've got in each of the principal client groups, but then some other properties that you might have, just so that people, if they're looking at your data, can understand the kind of business model you've got and perhaps how big you are from the turnover that you have and from the number of staff you've got. So all this information, if you're doing a bespoke peer group, is available to you. So you can zoom into the organizations that look most like you. Right. Let me just check the Q&A. Right. I hope you're all still there. I'm going to just stop sharing to make, yes, you are still there. Right. So I'm going to get, that's just a preamble. I'm now going to get stuck into the first theme. So as I mentioned, as I go through it, if you've got any questions on, in this case, lettings and voids, just use the Q&A function, just type it in and I'll pick it up at the end of this section. So lettings and voids metrics, as I've just said, these are the kind of metrics that are differentiated by client group because it's more helpful to you that we split it out so that you can compare like with like. The definitions borrow heavily from core. So those of you that also fill out core returns, there's a read across between the two, which is what you'd expect. So the three metrics I'm going to cover now are the percentage of rent lost through dwellings being vacant, the average relet time metrics, and relets as a percentage of stock. So, right, this is the bit where you need to kind of breathe through your eyelids. This is a decent amount of detail, but if you signed up for this, I guess this is what you want. So, percentage of rent lost through dwellings being vacant. What's this metric about? It's looking to see to what extent you're optimizing the use of social assets. It's about revenue maximization, which clearly, when times is tough, you need to maximize that revenue. It's also about understanding the return on investment foregone from unused assets, because whether you like it or not, yes, you all do lots of lovely things for humanity and everything. Your business is built on physical assets, and the way in which you use those means that you can do more or less good stuff with it. So the calculation, quite simply, is the rent and service charges lost through dwellings being vacant divided by the gross rent and service charges receivable. And you multiply it out by 100 to give you a percentage. So if we dig a bit deeper into the denominator, which is the bit that you divide things by, what do we mean by gross rent and service charges receivable? We mean the total potential, my teeth again, rent and service charges collectible for the period in question for all dwellings if all dwellings had been occupied. So the dwelling could be vacant for any reason, and that includes unavailable to let, where the principal one is probably major works or being held for decant. So you're not excluding major works at all, because that's not what this is about. The next metric, your void turnaround metric, that excludes major works. This metric is trying to do a different thing. You see, the average relet metric is trying to understand how well you are faring at a key business process. This metric isn't quite so interested in this, in that. This metric is looking to see how much money you're losing from your assets just sitting there not doing anything, even if there's a good reason for it. So really, it is, your dwellings could be vacant for absolutely any reason, but the only reason you can exclude it from this is if that empty unit isn't ever going to be let as a social dwelling again. And we're talking about waiting for demolition. So if that is the case, they can be excluded, and they're excluded from the entire calculation. If you collect this quarterly, and there's a few clubs that do, the top number, the numerator, is the year-to-date rent and service loss, and the denominator, the number below, is the prorated annual rent service charge. So again, I'm really labouring this point. Unlike the next metric, you include major works in this calculation. So hopefully that's fairly straightforward. This one's a bit more complicated because of you do have to consider major works, and there's a very specific definition to understanding major works, which I will get to. So average relet time is in calendar days. The rationale, as I've already said, this is really about understanding the efficiency of a key business process. And what this metric does is it isolates bog standard voids, vanilla voids, the majority of your voids, which are otherwise known as standard or routine relets. What do I mean by that? No major works are included in this metric, and I'll come to how the definition of that shortly. No new lets, no successions, no exchanges, no voids held for decant. If you have got a number of major work voids, when they're finished, they will never come into this calculation. They never convert to a standard routine. They will always stand outside of this metric. So yeah, you let it, but it will never feature in this. So the calculation basically is the total number of days your standard relet properties were vacant in the period, divided by the number of standard relet lettings in the period. That's the basic calculation. By number of days vacant, we mean the number of days between the tenancy end date and the tenancy start date. The day the property goes vacant does not count, nor does the day that it was let, because it's let. So you're counting the days in between. You can get 0 days for this. You can never get, and a 0 day would obviously, it's becomes vacant and then it's let the next day. That's 0 days. You could never get a negative relet here. And despite COVID and despite Brexit, a calendar day, there are still 7 days in a week. Back in the day when people had tons of squats and this, that, and the other, and the police were using stuff, the definition needed, it can still happen, so I'll just touch upon it, but if you've got any squatted properties that you get possession of, you start to count from the repossession day. And if you've handed accommodation to the police for surveillance or whatever, you count that from the day they give it back. The sad thing with this metric is that there can be a massive sting in the tail for those problematic routine lets that you've had for absolutely ages, because often it might be because nobody wants it, and you finally succeed in letting it. Well, it's going to make your day, your result on this particular metric look a bit sick, because you only include voids in this calculation once let, and you do include the whole time, even if it spans the period in question. So it might go from 1 year to another, or 1 quarter to another, or whatever. It doesn't matter. You count it as soon as it's let, And in some cases, that can be quite a long time. So, as I say, this definition completely hinges, because you need to exclude major works for this, because we're only interested in routine lets. Differentiating between a standard or routine void and a major work void is really important. So this is the definition. The acid test boils down to if a tenant was actually in this property, would you decant them to fix it up? So you can only call it a major works void if somebody was in there, you wanted to fix it, and you thought it's unreasonable for us to leave them in there while we fix things around them. We're going to have to decant them. That should be the test of whether it's a major works void. And typically the kind of work that we're talking about is stuff that is about maintaining the property as a habitable dwelling. So we're talking about structural stuff to floors, walls and roofs. We're talking about site works around, you know, and obviously the concern there is health and safety, not dropping breeze blocks on people's heads, that kind of stuff. It could be about service installations, such as gas, electric, water, etc. Or it can be any work that significantly improves the dwelling. Now, this last one might be of particular interest to you, because I know there's a number of you that when you get a void, you do what I would call planned maintenance. But obviously doing planned maintenance in a void, when it becomes void, isn't really planned. So it's kind of like it's a bit, I'm probably being a bit anal here, but it's kind of, it's an oxymoron. But the point is if that's the kind of work that you sometimes save to do during the void period, and it's the kind of work that, had a tenant been in there, you would decant them, well, you can call it major works. This is important for those of you that do a reasonable amount of your planned maintenance in this way, because if you think about it, what it's doing is it's stretching out your routine void turnaround, which you're not really comparing like with like. So all I'm saying is that if those kinds of works are going to extend, you know, if they're extending your void period, you need to be whipping them out, because they do constitute major work voids, but only if you would decant them, as I said. Final metric here is just quite a simple one. It's the, I can't see it properly because I've got my taskbar in the way. Yeah, it's relets as a percentage of stock. It's fairly straightforward. The reason for having this is it provides context for the other two voids and lettings indicators. It may indicate churn for whatever reason. It may be a good reason, i.e. you're into supported housing and you've got a throughput of people that you're helping. It might be for a bad reason, i.e. it's difficult to let. So that's why I say this is more about context than anything else. The calculation is the number of properties relet during the period divided by the number of properties managed, multiply it out by 100 to get a percentage. The definition is that it's about relets as a proportion of the units managed. You would exclude owned stock if it's not managed by you. As with void loss, you include your dwellings vacant for any reason, even major works here, except where they're not going to be used for social housing again. So if you remember with that metric, you just included absolutely all your voids, your major work ones, whatever, as long as they were going to be used for social housing again, you include them, and the same goes for this metric. And that should be that. So I'm going to pause there and hoover up any questions. Yes. So Elizabeth Rowland is saying, it's a good one. Would you also exclude properties that have been earmarked for disposal from the vacant property metric? Yes, you would, on the same basis that it's awaiting demolition or whatever. It's going to leave your stock. It's not going to be used for social housing again. So yeah, I would definitely treat that in the same way. Again, it goes back to what I was saying, because you will find quite often that metrics are silent on certain issues, but the thrust of these metrics, you go back to what is it trying to achieve. It's not trying to skew your figures by properties that you're holding because you've already made the decision to demolish or dispose. So hope that's okay, hope that's clear. So that's that one done. Belinda Eastland is talking about heating upgrades, new kitchens and bathrooms. Can we count these as major works? It's a really good question, and we could debate this for ages. I go back to the point about the acid test is, would you decant the person to do this work? Now, depending on how extensive and how disruptive this is, some organizations might decant somebody for this work. Others might have, typically bigger organizations, they might have some kind of flat all set up so that somebody can go and use the kitchen there for the 2 days that their kitchen is out of action, or there's a bathroom out of action. They can go and use a bathroom in a vacant flat down the hall or something like that. So the point is there's no hard and fast issue here. If basically your set of circumstances mean that you would have to decant someone to do this kind of work in your context, in the way that your properties are configured, well, you can count this as major works. But if actually you can work around them, you wouldn't count it as major work. So it's not hard and fast. This is actually your judgment, and you just being comfortable with that judgment within the spirit of what this metric is aiming for. So hope that's okay. I'm not sitting on the fence, definitely not. Right, so I don't think there's any more questions there. So again, I apologize for the relentless nature of this, but it will make you stronger people. Right, I'm going to share the screen again and crack on with the next thrilling installment. Right, so we're on to rent collection and arrears. Just like the last lot, these tend to be differentiated by client group, by general needs, by HFOP, by support, to facilitate like comparisons. We're talking about 3 metrics here because there are, some of you will collect a few minor other metrics, particularly around those of you that have delved deeper into universal credit and stuff like that. Since not all of you do that, I'm not focusing on that. If you have got queries on those, we can sort it out outside this session. So we're talking about rent collected as a percentage of rent owed. We're talking about current arrears as a percentage of the annual rent debit. And because a reasonable amount of you collect this, we'll briefly touch on rent arrears net of unpaid housing benefit, or for those of you that collect this, that's the metric that deals with technical arrears due to the slings and arrows of outrageous housing benefit cycles. So rent collected as a percentage of rent owed. What's the rationale for this? Again, a bit like the voids turnaround indicator, this is about looking at the efficiency of a key business process. It is about income maximization, that you're hoovering up as much money that you're entitled to as possible, so that you can do all the good stuff that you do. So it gives you a financial sufficiency to do what you need to do. The calculation is the actual rent and service charge income received year to date, divided by the actual rent and service charges due year to date. I don't think there's much contentious there. The reason it's phrased year to date, and as I've touched upon, these metrics all, we've used them for many years, a lot of them, and they have different vintages. They came on stream at different times, and therefore sometimes there's a slight different change in the wording, that they're not consistent necessarily in some of the phrasing, simply because of their timing when they first came in. So this metric is solely interested in the effectiveness of the current in-year collection process, whereas the next metric, which is your arrears metric, reflects the historic position. So for instance, your arrears metric might reflect, performance for years in the past, and typically what besets organizations from time to time is they take their eye off the ball, and something, or they were firefighting, or they lost a member of staff or whatever, and they have a blip in their rent collection process 1 year where it makes their arrears go up, and that still shows up in their arrears figure 3 years on. So that's what the next metric, the arrears metric, tends to reflect. There's a degree of history in it. With this metric, the rent collected, it's very much about how you're performing now in the current year, how much of the rent and service charges you're getting in. So because of that, and because it's not carrying forward any arrears from previous years, it is possible to score over 100%. I have seen something as high as 116% for quite a small organization. So you get these mad skewing effects. The smaller an organization is, or the smaller the data set, you can get some wacky figures. But yes, it's very, very common to see 100%. It's potentially 103%, 104%. And of course, what that means, if you're scoring over 100%, is that you're making headway into those historic arrears. You should never include any garage arrears or garage debit in any of this. We're not interested in garages at all. What do we mean by the numerator there, the actual rent and service charge income received? We mean actual. That means no adjustments. You do not fiddle with the figures here. Now, the big way that people fiddle is by saying, oh yeah, this just isn't fair, I have to take this snapshot on the 31st of March, and I've got a big wodge of housing benefit coming in on the 1st. It's just not fair. Tough. That's this. You don't fiddle with this indicator at all. You take it as it is, and we all have to accept that there's a housing benefit cycle, and it just happens. You should never be presenting this data just by itself. There should always be a commentary in whether we're talking about it in a club, whether you're presenting it in a tenant publication, there'll always be a commentary that accompanies it. So if you want to explain that you were damned unlucky with that housing benefit coming in the day after, you can explain it, but you don't fiddle with the figures. And the same goes for fiddling around prepayments, post payments. So yeah, the point is that third metric in this particular theme, the arrears net of housing benefit, that's where you can fiddle with your housing benefit and allow for that figure coming in. Where possible, and I know this is very difficult with smaller organisations, the big housing associations can do this relatively easily, but other non-rent / service charge items collected by you should be excluded if you can. So obviously what we're talking about here is stuff like water rates, court costs, repairs, recharges, overpaid housing benefit. If there is any way that you can whip that out, because it's not rent and service charges, we want that out. If that's too fiddly and not worth it, you're not able to split it out, count it in both your numerator and your denominator. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you can exclude it, it's excluded totally from it. But if you can't, you should be including it in both the top figure there and the bottom figure. And my final bullet, I'm going to have to move my cursor again. So in terms of the denominator, the figure below, you should be excluding void rent loss. So this rent collection is about collecting the rent. It's not about collecting void rent loss. We're only interested in what you're. We're only interested in tenanted properties. So yeah, we're talking about actual rent and service charges due. No way does void rent loss figure in that. It's about what's due from tenanted properties. And as I've already said, you are not bringing forward arrears from previous years or anything like that, because this collection figure is the only arrears that will be reflected in this metric is arrears that fall within the year because you've not collected 100% or more. God, I made a meal of that one, didn't I? Right, so next metric. This is the current tenant arrears as a percentage of the annual rent debit. So as I've already said, this definitely reflects a historical position beyond the year in question. So yeah, you can still be feeling the effects of something that happened 3 years ago because it's showing up in the again, this is the reason for this metric is to see that you've got an effective arrears process, that you're maximizing your income, that you're reducing any arrears. I think, although people compare this, I think it's particularly useful to look at your own performance over a period of time. The calculation is actual current tenant rent and service charge arrears at period end, divided by the annual rent and service debit for the current financial year. So if you like, you're looking at your total arrears position, which includes any arrears accrued this year. It's the historical position, sits at the top, but the denominator below, we are only interested in the rent and service debit for the current financial year. And again, void loss doesn't feature in this. It's about the rent and service charges you're expecting from tenanted properties. So you are excluding a void loss. You are, again, as with the previous metric, trying to exclude court costs, sundry debts, and garages from this. You are excluding arrears from any previous tenancy and FTAs. We're just interested in the current current arrears from current tenants, even if they've held that tenancy for more than a year. Advance payments and credits should be excluded. So on the previous metric, I was saying you don't fiddle with it at all. with this one, you are excluding advance payments and credits. And the reason for that is it masks the true arrears. This is about arrears, it's not about collection. And somebody that's paid you in advance, or they've got a big credit on there, they can just ask for it back. And so that will, again, that will skew your figures. So that's why we're taking off the advance payments. Just as with the last metric, you are not adjusting for any late housing benefit at all. You just have to suck that one up. And as I say, the next metric deals with, allows you to adjust. It's basically, yeah, the next metric is a variant of this metric that simply allows you to fiddle with it. So I am not going to go into the next bullet point, but those of you that collect this metric on a quarterly basis may or may not have spotted a little problem with this, because if you are collecting quarterly, how the bloody hell do you provide an annual rent debit, which is the denominator, the figure below there? How do you provide an annual rent debit for the current financial year that excludes void loss if you're only, say, a quarter into the year, because you don't know what voids you're going to get for the rest of the year? So what follows there is the way in which you predict the future, basically. So it's just a little fix to help you sort out that metric if you're collecting it within year. So I'll just leave that fluttering, and you can read that in bed tonight. Hang on. Sorry about that. So finally, as I've already suggested, the rent arrears net of unpaid housing benefit is simply a variant of the last metric that enables you to manipulate that housing benefit figure. So it's exactly the same. If you know, if you need to adjust for that housing benefit cycle, it actually enables that, and it gives you, like, if you like, it deals with the technical arrears figure. It gives you a truer picture of where you think you should be, that allows for the cycle. Simple as that. And all you do is you simply exclude any arrears due to late housing benefit payments. That's it. I'm not going to say anything about it. So I think that's this section. I'm going to have a quick look at the Q&A. Althea Mitchum is saying we estimate it. I think she's referring to the in-year calculation there. I think that's probably okay, but I have given you, yeah, right, yeah. Althea's just come back and said yes. So yeah, all I'd say is I came up with the way of solving that problem, predicting the future of what your void loss might be, with my colleague at Housemart. That is the official way that Housemart tell their punters how to calculate it as well. As I've said about doing the definitions, it would be great if we can all stick to the same format. So yeah, I just commend that way of dealing with the quarterly payments to you. Right, so that's done. That's done. Paul Tewksbury. Asks the question, would you include share ownership properties in arrears calculations? Good question. I take you back, Paul, to my preamble saying that the vast majority of benchmarking, as it is, there'll be subtle changes to this with the TSMs that will be collected. But we're mainly interested in the 3 primary forms of social housing that most of our members trade in, day in, day out. So we're talking about general needs, we're talking about housing for older people, formerly known as sheltered, and we're talking about supported housing. So shared ownership is completely out of this. It's not included. As I say, we're interested, I think, in shared ownership properties, but only on that profile page, just to kind of understand your business model, so that when people can find those organizations that might be as diverse or not as themselves. So the only thing that, a bit of a spoiler alert for the workshop 3 is, from memory, I still need to bone up on this in time for next week's webinar on that. But I'm fairly sure shared ownership is a form of social housing that the TSM is interested in. So whilst I'm saying with our metrics here, shared ownership is outside, we're not interested in it, I think you'll find that with the TSM's shared ownership very much is included. And then Chris Panting is saying, is there any formal PI for the increase in former tenants' arrears as a percentage of rent debit? If not, there should be. Chris, we have definitely got, it's one of the more minor metrics, but we certainly collect a metric for FTAs, and I think it is expressed as a percentage of rent debit. Let me come back on that, but I'm fairly sure that is the way. I haven't included it in this because it's a relatively minor metric, but I'm fairly sure that is expressed as a percentage of the current rent debit too. I will check it out. Okay. Right, so I think we're up to date with questions so far. Right, I'm going to canter through the rest at pace. I hope you're all bearing with me. Right, so we are now on to the repairs and maintenance metrics. Now, unlike the previous metrics, these apply, we don't differentiate by client group. They are just, these are the properties that you manage, whether they're GN, HFOP, supported housing. So we're just interested in the property and not breaking it down. Here's my list of the key metrics that we tend to collect across the clubs. So we talk about average number of responsive repairs per unit, the percentage of repairs completed at the first visit, the average end-to-end time for all reactive repairs. And then in the remaining metrics, I'm just going to spend I'm not going to include them in this talk, because as you can see from some of my kind of annotations there, they are going to feature more in workshop 3, because these are the metrics that overlap or have a direct bearing on the TSMs, and that we've had to, if you like, amalgamate or drop because of confusion. So many of you collect what I would say are the real old school repairs completed within target time. Now, some clubs collected that HMPI 70, which just basically captured all responsive repairs. It was like an aggregate figure for emergencies, urgent, and routine repairs. So it just gave you an aggregate figure. What we've done is, because the TSMs, the regulator is introducing 2 metrics that look at responsive repairs times and you know, the extent to which you're achieving your target response times. They're looking at it in terms of urgence and not urgence. What the regulator's doing just cuts across all of these. So what we're suggesting with that HMPI 70, which is the big aggregate one, is we're kind of dropping it from the suite entirely, because it cuts across and could be confused with the regulator's metric RPO2 brackets 1. And that, if you look down to my sub-bullets there, you can see GNPI 19 and PI 20. Now they both collect your routine your urgent repairs and the routine repairs. Now, what the regulator's RPO2 brackets 1 does is aggregate those two metrics, but it doesn't go so far as aggregating with emergencies. So, and this is where things get horribly complicated. So HMPI 70 and GNPI 19 and 20 just could get horribly confused. So we're going to drop HMPI 70 entirely as an aggregate figure, so that it doesn't get confused with the regulator's TSM RPO2 brackets 1, which aggregates our existing urgent and routine repairs. I know that's really horrible, but if you sit and stare at this long enough, you'll get where I'm going with it. As for the emergency repairs completed within target time, basically we're rebadging that because it pretty much ties in with the regulator's emergency repairs metric, which is, for those aficionados, RPO2 brackets 2. So that's what's happening there. More detail on this in workshop 3. So cracking on with the percentage of dwellings with a valid gas safety certificate. This is the original gas safety metric that it was the one, if you remember, on the 31st of March, you could have a big burst through March, sorting out all your gas certificates, getting into everywhere where you failed. And, you know, the idea was to try and get 100% gas safety certificates on the 31st of March. So it's the old metric. Many clubs adopted the one below it, which is the gas safety checks completed within target. That was a more onerous, that was a more difficult one, because as I say, the previous gas one, you could have certificates that had fallen out of date through the year, but you just go bonkers in the last month, and you could pass that test on that one. So that second gas safety check forced organizations to have a system where 2 months before or a month before your certificate was up, you had a system that got you in there and it kept all your certificates within target. So it's much more difficult to do, and, you know, a much better way of doing things. So what we've done is, because the regulators now got a metric that does the same thing as that bottom gas safety check, we have just rebadged that one as the TSM metric BS01. As for the slightly long in the tooth original gas metric, we're going to kill that off so you don't get confused between that one and the new regulatory metric. So I hope that's reasonably clear. I know this is horrible, but do you know how long it's taken me to actually work through this detail? So as far as I'm concerned, you lot have got off lightly. Right, so back to the repairs that, the metrics that have that continue, that haven't been affected by the implementation of the TSMs. We've got the average number of responsive repairs, really straightforward indicator. It's as much about context as performance. There might be a whole host of reasons By you have high numbers, it might be to do with your tenant or stock profile, i.e. you just, you've got very needy tenants, or you've got very knackered old stock. Or it could be about process. It could be about poor staff training, poor diagnostics, poor application of the repairs policy. That's for you to work out. So the calculation is quite simple. Total number of responsive repairs orders during the period divided by the total number of units for which you're responsible. The definition of reactive or responsive is absolutely key to this metric. It means all minor or ad hoc unplanned repairs, regardless of priority. It's as simple as that. They could be reported by tenants, or they could be about common parts as well. So really, we are capturing a lot of repairs in that definition. It also has to be a defect that the landlord is responsible for. And we are very much interested in jobs rather than composite SOR lines. It's not an exact science. It will need a degree of judgment on your part. You are definitely excluding cyclical works from this. Do not include those, and do not include any repairs that come out of the cyclical. So for instance, if you're doing some gas work, obviously a gas inspection and any work associated with that is part of a cyclical program, and therefore shouldn't be included in this. But in executing that, there might be some making good type repairs or associated knock-on repairs from that. They're not included in this metric either, because ultimately their origin was within cyclical, so they can come out. And of course, you're not including any void works in this. We are talking about non-void responsive repairs. Those of you that have had to put up with me over many years will know that I don't particularly like this metric, but I know a lot of your board members do, so we're kind of stuck with it. It has its problems. It's been fiddled with so many times over the years that I think it's kind of corrupted. Actually, its origin was very much about getting councils to smarten up their responsive repairs, and it actually aimed to encourage the provision of multi-trade operatives in vans with impressed stock, so they could fix things in one hit. Then people over time have felt that there are certain issues that or just certain instances where actually this metric is very crude and it's not helpful. So it's been tweaked so many times, it now feels super clunky. And if you're a smaller organization, it also fails to pick up that lots of smaller housing association tenants are really happy for the operative to kind of visit and say, oh, right, I just need to get this, that, and the other. I'm just going to nip to B&Q. I'll be back in half an hour. Strictly speaking, that's 2 visits. So it can't be, that's not doing it in one hit. So you'd actually fail on that. But the tenant would, in that kind of case, isn't really put out, and they're delighted that it can be done anyway. So yeah, it's a problem, this one. And as I've said, a few bullets down as well, it actually now allows for multiple trade visits. I mean, if you think back, this was all about getting a job done in one hit with a multi-skilled operative. But the definition now allows for multiple trade visits where that is absolutely essential, where you really do need a spark in there, followed by a plasterer, followed by a decorator or whatever. but it should only be where it's absolutely essential and known in advance. And the kind of job we're talking about are those complex, complex jobs that really do require different trades in there. And the reason this is now included is because at some point in the past, there's been sufficient people moaning about it that we've got loads of these cases, and we've got really good systems and everything, but because of it, we fail on this metric. So it's, as I say, it's just been fiddled about with so much. I do think it's very clunky now, but what you really need to know about it is you don't have to include, if you've sent somebody to do a diagnostic pre-inspection, because it's a pre-inspection with no intention of repairing, you don't have to include that as a repair. It's really about zooming into the remedial action. And if you can't get access, that gets excluded as well. I would say, as the essence, the actual definition is silent about whether it should apply to communal repairs. But again, if you adopt the golden rule, what is it that this metric was trying to achieve? It was trying to achieve really good customer service, and that a sitting tenant wasn't being inconvenienced by having to wait at home all day or whatever. So I would say arguably communal repair shouldn't be included either. Average end-to-end time for all reactive. Now, this was the repair that came in about 12 years ago, when lots of bigger organizations gave up on what I consider to be those old school repairs time band metrics that the regulator has actually resurrected. So they actually got rid of all those time banded ones because they rightly said, there's no point in comparing organizations on their performance against time bands if they can all set different time bands. And of course, it's a completely valid point. As far as I'm concerned, that's not good benchmarking. So this metric came in to deal with that problem. And basically the calculation goes, it's the sum of the total number of calendar days taken to complete the responsive repairs in the given period, divided by the total number of responsive repairs completed in the period. And basically, the thinking is that why this is a good metric is ultimately tenants just want a timely service, that it gets done in as short a time as possible within reason, and that the shorter the average turnaround in those repairs, it should point to the fact that you've got a more efficient repairs process. Of course, none of that takes into account satisfaction. In terms of delving deeper in that definition, the average number of calendar days is between the responsive repair being requested and its satisfactory completion. It includes the day of request and the day of completion. So you need to be taking it from the day it was ordered, or the day the tenant phoned it in, to the day it was actually completed. The date of satisfactory completion, because as we know, some jobs drag on or need another visit, that date of satisfactory completion is decided by the landlord. Right, I'm going to pause there before I go through satisfaction. There are no questions on that. I think that's probably because I've beaten you all into submission. So you'll be very relieved to know that this is, we're in the final canter through now, much of which can be picked up in workshop 3 because it's satisfaction. And as we know, the TSMs are 50% satisfaction metrics. So I will, without further ado, take us into the final straight. So, satisfaction. I'm not going to get into any of the surveying practice that underpins satisfaction. It's really beyond the scope of this because I'm just zooming in on the metrics themselves. What you do need to know about that is we're resuming our face-to-face annual conference in April. We're going to have a session about everything that you need to know about nailing your TSM satisfaction survey. Obviously, I would commend our annual conference to you. It's always been good fun. It's a brilliant way to actually network. Probably there's as much value in the networking and talking to people that are in a similar boat to you, which I would characterize in the smaller organizations. Many of you are very senior people. You're basically running around like blue-ass flies trying to, keep all the plates in the air. Sometimes it's good to share that burden with other people and see how they're cracking it. So I would commend it to you. The content's going to be very good as well. So watch out for that session there. But the key satisfaction metrics that we stick into your annual reports and that you report on are listed there. And they are governed by the STAR survey methodology, which is still current. It's still the guiding methodology. What you have to clock is that any of those metrics that have been superseded, or what I've said, I've called rebadged by the TSMs, and I've flagged them all there. Any of those that have been basically superseded by the TSMs, the methodology and everything that you need to know about them will be governed by the regulators' technical guidance that they produced with their decision statement on this. And again, I'll go into all this in detail in workshop 3. So all you need to do at this point is clock which of your existing metrics have now been superseded by the regulatory metrics. So there they are. We're talking about overall satisfaction. We're talking about the perception of that STA 006, which is the satisfaction with repairs. That's the perception one, not the transactional one. So the regulators snaffled that one as well, because those of you that have looked at the regulators' guidance in depth will be aware that there's not a single transactional satisfaction metric there. They are all perception. Now, what we're saying with the metric that's below there, HMPI 102, which is exactly the same metric, but it's the one that a number of you do on a transactional basis, that still has value, and the regulator recognizes that still has value, because it has value in the sense that there's a number of you that want real-time data coming in, every quarter or perhaps every month, for you to be able to finely tune your repairs and maintenance services. So that's up to you whether you carry on collecting that. The other ones that have been rebadged are satisfaction with listening and acting, satisfaction with safety and security of the home. So as I say, for each of those that have been rebadged, I'll be covering those in workshop 3, and the governing guidance for that will no longer be STAR. It'll be the regulators' TSM guidance. So that leaves a bunch of metrics here that haven't been rebadged, and I'll tell you a bit about those now. So those remaining star metrics, you to be able to populate your data fields, to be able to report on those as benchmarking metrics, you need to be adhering to the star methodology still. Now, Acuity is getting together with Housemark. Housemark are the guardians of star, and we are going to be talking to them about a way forward, like basically, what's the status of star in a post, TSM, because we've got the TSM regulating, where does star sit with the regulator? At the moment, don't worry about it. Star is still current. If you want, you'll want to still collect those non-TSM metrics. So star is still the governing methodology for that. And on these slides, I've given a hypertext link to the methodology there. So the kind of methodology we're talking about, we haven't got time to get stuck into all the detail of it. You do have to be asking those questions of your tenants in a very specific way. You have to be phrasing the questions. There has to be 5 response categories with a neutral middle. And you have to be getting an appropriate sample size. It's well understood, especially for the very small organizations, that it's very difficult getting a sample size, and that quite often you have to resort to a census. Well understood. I have given you a hypertext link to a handy calculator that helps you determine what the appropriate sample size is for you, depending on how many tenants you've got, whatever. That links up to our website, so it's all good. Data, as long as you have collected your data in accordance with STAR methodology, your results are good to go from such a survey. There are other minority sport satisfaction metrics that we collect that I haven't listed there, but they only apply to certain clubs, and they're around stuff like satisfaction with ASB and satisfaction with complaints. As I say, they're a minority sport. Only a few of you collect them. Now, they really do overlap these with the TSMs. But the regulator collects them on a perception basis and not a transactional basis. So those of you that already collect this, collect it on a transactional basis. So there are implications there that I'm not going to go into now, but rest assured they will be covered in workshop 3. The final thing I want to say about all of this is, if you're worried about your satisfaction data, and it's yet one more thing to get your head around with everything else that's bashing the sector at the moment, it's just a reminder that we are one of the country's key survey providers. You'll see that I'm slipping into shameless sales plug here. So we can help you with that. Basically kind of an end-to-end potential service, or just bits of the service. But I mean, we could basically help you formulate the entire way that you crack your satisfaction surveys, whether that includes the regulatory ones or you just want to do it in general. And so we can help you think your way through it, come up with a survey strategy, as well as ask the questions, as well as provide you with a report that enables you to actually act on the results. The fact that it's done by a third party also gives your stakeholders, not least your tenants and the regulator, a degree of assurance that there's credibility to the actual results, if you like. So that's all I'm going to say about satisfaction. As I say, a number of these issues will be revisited in workshop 3. Spookily, I don't know how I managed that, because you will all know how useless I am at timekeeping, but I think I'm bang on the money. There aren't any other QAs there. That's probably because there's the thud of bodies up and down the country as you've thrown yourselves out of the window. If there are any last minute questions, let me know. I know this has been relentless and more than anybody should have to bear, but I do hope it's been useful in terms of cantering through the key things that you need to get right in each of the definitions. I would commend you to double check the definitions using the little blue question mark. And we are more than happy to take your phone call if you feel that it's still not clear, you're still not clear on a definition. You just get on the blower to us, we'll sort it out. If we can't answer it immediately, we'll even probably get on the blower if it's something that needs to be talked through, because it's impossible from the definition to know which way to jump. We will get on the blower to Housemark and discuss it with them. So both Housemark and Acuity are operating off the same hymn sheet. So, as there are no more questions, thank you for signing up for this. I really hope it helps. I hope it helps in the data quality. We're going to be getting stuck into the financial / cost metrics on Thursday, and next Wednesday we're going to get stuck into the TSMs. There is still time to cancel both of those if you've had enough today, but otherwise I'd also suggest that you get any of your colleagues that have an interest in this, sign up for them. So again, thanks for tuning in. And I'll see those of you that are really into torturing yourselves. I'll see you on Thursday. Thanks very much.